Okay, good morning, everyone. We are delighted to have Rabbi Silverman with us again to share some fascinating words as always. So I'll hand over.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Avi, and Maltov to you on your community, Rabbi. Thank you. Lovely to be with you again. I'd like to speak this morning about somebody who is called an Eloi. And we know the word Eloi means a genius. And this particular person, his name was Shlomo Poliachik. And he was born near Grodno in 1877. And he's known as the Eloi of Mechik because that was the town where he was from. And every cheder he went to, they couldn't hold him anymore. He knew too much. His brain was an amazing thing. When he was 11, he was brought to Volozhin Yeshiva, and he was told, the Netziv, who was the head of the yeshiva, was told that this boy had a fantastic brain. So he tested him, and he gave him parts of the Gemara to go and learn. Before he'd left the room, he already knew the answer to the question. And in fact, Chaim Soloveitchik, who was the second Rosh Hashiva at the time, when he tested him himself, and remember, he was only 12 years of age, he said, this boy has an amazing brain. We will call him the Eloi of Mechik. And he was 12 years old. He celebrated his bar mitzvah at the yeshiva. Now, we've already mentioned in the first half of the 19th century, boys came to the yeshiva at the ages of 8, 9, 10, 11. But towards the end of the century, it was very unusual. So he was an amazing person. So he celebrated his bar mitzvah at the Volozhin, and then in 1892, the government closed down the yeshiva. Why did they close it down? Supposedly because they wouldn't bring in secular studies into the yeshiva, like the Russian language and like mathematics. But actually, the real reason, it was found out years later when Russian documents were allowed out of the Soviet Union, was because of unrest. The government could not bear any revolutionary, socialist, any propaganda. What happened was that within the yeshiva, towards the end of its period, there were those who wanted Musar, ethical books being taught in the yeshiva, and those who were opposed to it. And things like that, the government could not stand, because to them, any unrest was against the law. And so, on the pretext of not including secular languages within the yeshiva, they closed it down. And the real reason was only found out about a century later. What happened when the yeshiva closed was that the Eloi, Rabbi Shlomo Poliachik, who was still only a youngster in his teens, he came to Minsk, where his teacher, Chaim Soloveitchik, was at the time. And when Chaim Soloveitchik's father passed away that same year, 1892, Reb Chaim became the Rav in place of him. And he arranged what they called a kibbutz, a gathering of youngsters around him. And Rab Shlomo Poliachik was one of them. As time went on, we come now to 1896. In 1896, Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, who was known as the Gadol Hador, passed away. And there was, after the Levaya, there was decided that would be a gathering of youngsters in his memory. And again, Shlomo Poliachik was one of them. Then the Alter of Slobodka, Nathan Zvi Finkel, his son Eliezer Yehuda, who was a classmate and also a chavruta of Shlomo Poliachik, decided that he wanted his friend to be immersed in Mussar studies. So he brought him over to Slobodka. Shlomo Poliachik was there for a very short time and said, I can't take this Mussar. It's not for me. It's not for everybody. So he left. and there was a kibbutz, a gathering formed by Chaim Ozer Gudzinski, who became the Gadol Hador after Yitzhak Elchanan Spector, and he gathered youngsters around him, and one of them was Shlomo Polyachik, and he stayed there for a number of years. And then in 1902, he got married, and eventually he had three daughters and two sons. In fact, those descendants are well known within various communities today. 3 years later, in 1905, we know that there was a revolutionary movement within the Soviet Union, and many of the Yeshivalite, tragically, they became involved in revolutionary activities, and they lost their faith. Shlomo Polyachik was not embroiled in that, but what happened was that he decided that he would go to Lydda. Now, Lydda was famous at the time because Yitzhak Yaakov Reines, who had founded the Mizrahi movement 3 years before, he founded a yeshiva in Lydda. And that particular yeshiva was famous because it introduced secular studies, which was unknown, secular studies in its activities. And what did Rabbi Reines said? The yeshiva's not going to be part of Mizrahi. That's something completely different. I want this yeshiva to be recognized within Soviet and Polish Jewry. So he decided that there should be the introduction of, besides Gemara, of course, there should be introduction of the Russian language, of Russian history, of Jewish history, of mathematics, so that when they graduated and they became Rabbonim, they would be well versed within not just Jewish, but secular studies as well. Because at the time, there were two rabbis in a community. There was the traditional one, the Talmid Chacham, and there was one called the Crown Rabbi, who was appointed by the government. Why? Because he had certain secular studies. Rav Reines decided that this should be within one rabbi. He should be Talmid Chacham, and he should also know about secular studies at the same time. So that's why he founded that yeshiva. The yeshiva continued until the First World War. And in 1905, Rabbi Shlomo Polyachik was elected the Rosh Yeshiva of that particular yeshiva in Lydda, which continued till the First World War. And then in 1915, Rabbi Reines passed away, and the yeshiva was dispersed all over the country. So tragically, what might have been a precursor of other yeshivot having that Western ideal of Jewish and secular studies was obliterated because of the First World War. And then in 1917, we know was the Russian Revolution, and we're talking about Ukraine today and what's happening there. Between 1917 and 1921, over 100,000 Jewish people were murdered by the Ukraine. And this is something, obviously, we have to remember. In the 17th century, the Khmelnytsky massacres, also in Ukraine, decimated the population. But this was after the First World War. Over 100,000 Jewish people were murdered. In 1919, Rab Shlomo Polyachik and his family decided that part of the world was not for them. So he came eventually to Poland. And in Bialystok, there was the Tachkemoni, I don't know if you've heard of it, the Tachkemoni Institute. That also was set up so that it would be just not only Jewish studies, but secular studies as well. And Reb Shlomo Polyachik, the Major to Eloi, he became the Rosh Yeshiva of that institution. He was there for 2 years, and then he had a call from America. The call was to be the Rosh Yeshiva of Yitzhak Elchanan in New York. Yitzhak Elchanan Seminary was set up in memory of Yitzhak Elchanan Spector, who had died in 1896. And in that same year, this was set up in New York in his memory. And now in 1922, he was given the call to become the Rosh Yeshiva of Yitzhak Elchanan. It was unusual because no Rav in Russia or in Poland had gone over to America. So he decided that he would take that challenge and he would go with his family to New York. And he arrived on the 1st of September 1922. And he met up with a number of people in America, Rabbanim, who had previously been in Russia and Poland, like Eliezer Silver and the others who were in the yeshiva in New York. And they welcomed him with open arms because they knew that if he such a gadol had a gadol in his time came over to America, it would bring with him others as well. And in fact, we know that in the next 6 years, people like Avraham Dov Kahana Shapira from Kovno and people who were famous in their time, they were brought over to America to become guest rabbis, only because he himself had come over to New York and he paved the way. In fact, we're told that when the great grandson of the Netziv, Moshe Soloveitchik, had his bar mitzvah, apparently the great grandfather said that he had heard a tradition in his family that Chaim Volozhiner had said, and Chaim Volozhiner died in 1821. He said the time will come when the last bastion of Torah will be in America. Can you imagine? That was said in the early 19th century, and it came true because in America now we know we have leading Rosh Yeshiva. So Shlomo Polyachik was instrumental in the fact that Moshe Feinstein and Yaakov Kamenetsky and others of that ilk eventually came over to settle in America. And this was unknown, and it would not have happened had he himself not come over. In the 6 years he was there, as I mentioned, Gedolei Hador were brought over as guest speakers into America. They came collecting for the yeshiva at the same time. And one of them actually said to him, "Why did you leave Russia? Why didn't you stay there?" He said, "Because in the end, I would have ended up coming to America to collect for my yeshiva." And the tragedy was that in 1928, he had come over to the opening of Torah Vodaas Yeshiva. Torah Vodaas was the name of the yeshiva in Lida. And why was it called that? Because we know Torah Umada, Torah Vadat. And it so happened that a disciple of Torah Vadat in Lida came over to New York, and he was one of the founders became the Torah Vadat Yeshiva in New York. And Shlomo Polyachik was at the opening of the yeshiva in 1928. The tragedy was that at the young age of 50, he had an abscess in his tooth, and it was found out too late. And from that, it spread to his body, and he passed away at the age of 50. The Hespedim were held for him in New York, in Israel, in Russia, in Poland, in all the great yeshivas. Hespedim were held for him. And he was held to be one of the great people of his generation. And we remember him today because he was known as the Idloi. In Kiryat Moshe in Yerushalayim today, there is a street known as Rehov HaEloi. That's all it's given, Rehov HaEloi. But everybody who knows it knows this refers to Reb Shlomo Polyachik, the Meicheta Eloi. And so he was a genius who was in his time known to be such a person. He had such a fantastic brain, and we are indebted for the fact that he was living in our 20th century, and we hope, please God, that there will be others of his ilk, and may his memory be for a blessing. Amen.
Thank you very, very much.
Yes, please.
Admit, I don't know about this, Rob. How come do many of you know